Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. As with all of my videos, if you'd like to jump from one section of the video to the other, there are direct links down in the video description. This week I have a couple of tidbits to share with you that have come up in my social media feed. I have some updated projects to share with you, and then just a little bit of talking about expectations in your projects and in yarn that you might buy, and what sorts of levels of perfection you might be expecting from yourself now that might be different from what you've expected before. So let's get started. So I have a couple of tidbits to share with you that have come up in my feed. One of them I told you a bit about last week, which is that in the United States that we have a National World War I museum that's located in Kansas City. And a couple of years ago, they did a lecture on knitting during World War I that they called Mrs. Wilson's Knitting Circle. And that it was given that name because during World War I, Woodrow Wilson was our president, and his wife really was encouraging the knitting for soldiers. And so this lecture was called Mrs. Wilson's Knitting Circle, and people came to the museum for that lecture, and they could bring their knitting, and there were some World War I era patterns that were available for people to look at as well. So that was a couple of years ago, and they planned to do this again on May 2nd, Saturday, which is tomorrow, unless you're watching this sometime later. And it's going to be at 10:30 in the morning, Central Daylight Time. And in order to watch the lecture live, you need to RSVP. I'm going to leave a link down in the video description. It might be cutting things short to get the RSVP, but if it's like it was before, they will put the video of the lecture on YouTube, and you'll be able to look at it later. So if that happens, I will let you guys know what the link is to that YouTube video. But if you want to see this lecture tomorrow, then go to the link that I'll leave down below, and you can RSVP, and then they'll send you a link so that you can watch the live stream of the event. I really don't know exactly what they're going to be talking about, other than it'll be talking about knitting during World War I, and I don't know if there's any sort of chat capability or ability to send in questions. There may be. I really don't know. I'm excited about this because this is really going to be the first knitting event that I have been to since the first weekend in March. The last knitting event that I went to was whatever that Saturday was, March 6th, I think it was. And I represented the Minnesota Knitters Guild at Gale Family Farm, which is owned by the County Parks Commission, and it's an educational facility, and they had a sheep shearing demonstration, and then they had different demonstrations by different people showing the whole process of going from the back of a sheep all the way through getting processed and spun into wool, and then knitting, and they had crafts and things for kids to do. It was a really fun event. It's the kind of thing I love to volunteer for on behalf of the Guild, because it lets me out in the public, and we can tell people about the Guild, we can show them how to knit, and I get to know other Guild members. Since then, every event that I would have gone to, including just knitting, weekly knitting groups or monthly knitting groups, I'm in a couple of different knitting groups, those have been canceled. Guild meetings have been canceled. The textile center is closed, so I can't use the library. I had a conference I was going to go to. There's a retreat I was going to teach at. All of those things have been canceled. And I really find that I need that interaction with knitters that is different from just being in the online forums. Before all of this happened, I loved the online forums because it was a way of interacting with knitters from around the world on my own time schedule. So if somebody asked a question anywhere in the world and I happened to be on the forums and I saw the question, I could answer it. And then the next time they were on, they could see it. So you could have a conversation that was not in real time. And I really loved that. I loved the fact that it made it possible to interact with knitters from around the world. But I really like just being with other knitters and sitting with them and seeing what they're working on and talking to them about that. So last Saturday, the monthly knitting group that I joined last fall, we did an online knitting group to see how it would work. A lot of people have been using Zoom lately. We used a service called Jitsi. I want to call it Jitsu, but it's Jitsi. I'll leave a link down below. It doesn't require you to load anything on your computer, and so it's a little bit less. There are fewer, I think, privacy concerns than some people have with Zoom. I know Zoom is trying to take care of some of the issues that some people have had, but Jitsu or Jitsi doesn't have that, and it's simpler to use as well. It was easier to just instantly figure out how to do things in that. So if you have a knitting group that you have been really missing and wanting to see and touch base with people, I'm going to leave a link down to Jitsi down below, and then maybe it's something that you could try out with your knitting group. The other thing that I have been really enjoying doing is the live stream Q&As that I've done. So I did one on Sunday. It was the second one that I did. And that is another way. It's not quite the same as actually being able to hear other people talking, but it's more of a real-time interaction with people where I'm answering questions and seeing the in the chat loop, people are talking to each other, but they're also asking me questions, and I can see them and I can answer them. And for me, it's a really fun way to spend an hour just interacting with knitters and learning about what are the kinds of things that people are wondering about, because I'm always wanting to make technique videos and talk about things that are of interest to people, and I have to do that based on just what I'm picking up on from other people. But it's better if I know specifically my audience, what they are interested in knowing about, that I might be interested in teaching. So I will probably be doing live streams again I'm not going to set an exact schedule, but probably every 3 weeks or so. And this time I did it on a Sunday afternoon, and I think that worked really well. We had people, I was hoping that it was going to hit enough time zones and be in a day of the week that would work for enough people, that I could get more people from more countries involved. There were people from India and Pakistan on there. There were people from all over Europe, and certainly, and there were even people who were probably less than a couple of miles away from me who were also in the chat. So that was really really fun. Turns out my daughter in the Netherlands was watching. I did not know that. And apparently she kept saying, "Hi, Mommy. Hi, Mommy." And I didn't see that. I was just looking at questions. I was looking for questions in the chat. And she asked a question about what am I watching right now, like streaming while I'm knitting. And I answered that question. I had no idea that it was her because I didn't look at the name of the person. I just looked at the question. So that was pretty funny that my daughter was in the Netherlands watching me do a live stream. So that was really fun. So another thing that came up in my feed that I thought was really interesting was that the National Museum of Northern Ireland, like museums everywhere, they're closed, but they're making their collections accessible. And they have it's called Warp and Weft story, and it's about sort of the story of flax to linen, so that the plant flax, how it was planted and harvested and then turned into fabric, and that because that was something that was done in Northern Ireland as it was done in many parts of the world. So there are photographs and there's information, and I thought it was really interesting. And I've gotten to the part about, I've been reading through the parts about how flax was grown and how it was harvested. Like they didn't cut it, because if they cut it, then they would lose 3 or 4 inches of the staple length. And so they had to pull the plants out, and that was how they harvested them. So it was really backbreaking work, as a lot of harvesting is. So I'm going to leave that down below. There's another, like the British Museum, they don't have really that much textile related things, but that came up my feed too, and I was getting it mixed up with the Victoria and Albert Museum, which has tons of fashion history and textile related things. So it's not the V&A, but it's still a world-class museum. But the British Museum had been planning on putting their entire collection online, and they just have moved it up so that it's sooner than it was. So if that's something that you really enjoy doing, just going through museums and looking at the collections and seeing what they have, the British Museum has done that, and I'll leave links to both museums down in the video description. So back at the beginning of February, I found, maybe it was at the end of January, I found out about this series of books. But at the beginning of February, I ordered all 8 books in this series of books that were published in the 1940s. They're these vintage knitting manuals. They were written by these 2 women who were sisters-in-law, Jane Coster and Margaret Murray. And they were published between 1940 and 1949. A couple of the issues were reprinted multiple times during the war. They have patterns for everyone in the family. So they have, babies, children, men, and women, and sometimes they'll have teenagers as well in there. And they really vary from book to book, the types of things they do and how they present it and what their focus is. So one of the things that I was talking about a few weeks ago, I wanted to create a pile of UFOs, unfinished objects, for me, so that when I would get distracted or frustrated or whatever, I could just turn to a different project and not have to think about what am I going to knit next, or spend time just kind of floundering a little bit. So I had some hat projects and some sock projects, and I decided, I would switch up between which knitting or sweater patterns I was going to be working on. And one of the things that I decided to do is, because none of us have been able to get haircuts, and my hair is getting a little long, and it's really starting to hang in my eyes now. It's not quite, it's more hair than I particularly like at the moment. And I thought I was going to get my hair cut this coming Thursday, May 7th, because the stay-at-home order was supposed to end Sunday night, but they've extended it here in Minnesota. Every state's different. So they've extended it here in Minnesota for 2 more weeks, so May 18th, but they're letting small businesses that can do curbside, pickup, they're letting them open. And they're going to see how this works and then gradually open up. But that means any close contact businesses like hairdressers and barbershops still closed. So my hair appointment's going to get pushed out again. So one of the things that I decided to do that would be fun was a vintage hat from this particular book. It's called Knitting for All. And it's the last of the 8 books that I actually received. I ordered them all on February 4th, and every one of them came within 2 weeks. And this one said it would be here no later than March 4th, and which was a couple of weeks after I'd received everything else. Some of the delivery dates, like expected delivery dates, they said that, it might be end of April before you get it. So some of them really push out like the amount of time that a book could take to arrive from overseas. Because all of them except one I had to order from used booksellers in the UK. So this one never came. And so I sent a message to the bookseller, are there times when they take longer? Did you do a tracking? Never heard back. So then I submitted a complaint to Abe Books, which is how I ordered it. And then they eventually, refunded me the money, and then I ordered it from another bookseller. And probably within a week, it showed up, and I thought, oh, that was really fast. And so, it showed up, and I've been looking through it. And then, like a week later, I got another one in the mail. Like, what happened? So the first one I got, this one, was actually the one that I had ordered in February, but I never heard back from the bookseller in any way. And so then the second one I got was the second book I ordered. So when I found out that I actually did get this book, I then again emailed the bookseller and said, I feel like I'm talking into a black hole here, but, I did receive this book after all, and I would like to pay you for it because I did receive it. And so lo and behold, somehow he got that message that I sent him, and then he invoiced me and I paid him. And course, never heard from him again. But I've got 2 copies of this book. But when I was first looking through it, what struck me about this I thought was really fun was a hat. And I thought, oh, well, that would be a fun thing to knit, just as a quick little project that would be fun to do and learn something about vintage stuff. And it's this 3-cornered hat, and it was in the solid color was one of the choices. And then the other choice was to do it with stripes. So the thing about this book is that every pattern has variations on it in this particular issue. The rest of them, they all have a different way they focus things. Some of the other books, like one of the other books, they do it by season. They have everything organized by season: summer, winter, spring, fall. But this one, it's variations, and so that's the thing. You can knit it with stripes. You can knit it plain. You can knit it, so that the point is hanging over your eye, or so the point is going behind. So I started working on it, and I have all of the knitting done. And I did the crocheting. So what you're doing is you're knitting this big triangle, and you're decreasing every row. So you end up with this, it almost looks like an arrowhead. So it's pointy at this end, and it goes all the way down to points that come back up like that. And you're supposed to fold the cast on edges and crochet them all the way around, and that creates the cap. And then the opening for the head, you do 4 rounds of US single crochet. In the UK, they call that double crochet. So I've gotten to the point where it's mostly done, but there's this finishing detail that I don't understand, that I'm going to do an overhead to show you guys what the instructions are and what I think they're trying to do, but I'm not really sure. And then maybe you guys can leave in the comments what you think these instructions mean. Okay, so this is what the hat looks like in the pictures. So this is with the point on the forehead, and this is when the point is in the back of the head. And trying to see how those little ears are shaped. They're obviously very flattened here, but they're flattened maybe in a different way. And then this one, it's harder to tell because it's dark. So the instructions say, now begin at the end of the center line of decreasing, that is at the edge of the hat midway between the 2 ears, and make a tuck on the wrong side of the work about 2.5 inches long, 1/2 inch deep at the center, and tapering off to the ends. Okay, so here is what I'm looking at right now. This is the opening for the head, and these are the 2 ears. So this is the place where they want this tuck to be, and they're saying 2.5 inches long, and then 1/2 inch deep, and then tapering off to the ends. And I don't know what they mean by tapering off to the ends. I don't know what ends they're talking about. I'm not really sure what the tuck is supposed to be or what it's supposed to look like. I think they're talking about basically pinching about 1/2 inch of fabric right here for that 2.5 inches, so that will create this kind of ditch right here between the 2 ears. I think that's what they're looking to do, and that will help keep the ears pointed up. What I don't know is how exactly to do that, like how to make that tuck. I'm not sure if I should just do some kind of a running stitch. I don't know. Like a tuck, there are different ways of doing tuck stitches. This is a tuck stitch from a hat I knit years ago. It's a Isolde Teague pattern, and the way that these tucks were formed as you were knitting was that you would get to a certain point, and then you would knit this stitch together with the back of a stitch that was further down. So that would, and you do that across this whole span of stitches. You would knit the stitch on the needle together with the back of a stitch, the purl bump of of a stitch that was maybe 10 rows below, and it would create these kinds of tucks. So that was, as you're knitting, something that you could do. So that's what I'm not sure about right here is I think I'm understanding that I have to create this half inch deep. I don't know if that means a half inch on each side. So it's a full inch of fabric gets pulled in, but a half inch on each side. And then how to make that happen. I don't know if I just seam it up in the middle. I just don't know. So that's the thing that I'm going to puzzle out. And if any of you think you've got a good idea about what ends they're talking about tapering down, maybe they just mean if I have a half inch like this, that I don't do that, I gradually taper it out so that it's not a half inch all the way to the end there and the end here. Maybe that's what that means. Oh, okay, so I got that. So I'm just not sure what to do, like how to create that tuck on this reverse side. So if anyone has any ideas, maybe even just crocheting along there would do it. Like crocheting, single crochet through the fabric? I don't know. Or slip stitch? I don't know. So tell me your ideas. So this is what it looks like on my little mannequin head. But I need to do this tuck thing right here in the middle that's somehow going to pull this together, pull the ears closer together somehow. Not really sure. So one of the things that I realized when I was first casting on this is like 286 stitches you have to cast on, and it took me a while to get the right number and to get the decreases started correctly in the center and all of that. I'd been working for a little while, and then I realized I was using the wrong needle size because the gauge for this is 7 stitches per inch. You use fingering weight yarn, and I had a set of needles on my desk that I'd just done some swatching for, and so I knew that I got 7 stitches per inch, but I realized after I'd started this that I get 7 stitches per inch on those needles when I was knitting in stockinette, and this is garter stitch, and those stitches tend to be a little wider, and so I knew that this was going to be a little too big, and I didn't really care because I'm not wearing this long term. It's just an exercise in trying something out. The thing is that I think that the fabric would have been a little stiffer. The hat would have been a little smaller, but the fabric would have been a little stiffer, and so it might have been a little easier to control. But again, I don't really super care, so I'll probably be wearing this a little bit next week in order to cover up my hair a little bit. But this was kind of a fun thing. It was very simple, and it taught me. It was like a low risk way of learning a different way of constructing something that I never would have figured out or thought to do on my own. So that's one of the reasons I like to do these kind of weird construction things, is because it just shows me a different way of spatially putting folding up a flat piece of fabric and how you can form it into other shapes. So, so this is the hat, this direction. Let's turn it around this way. So this is what there we go. So then it's over his jaunty little hat on his head right there. It almost looks like the god Mercury with his little wings here. So the other project that I'm working on right now is a pair of socks for my daughter. I did a pair of socks for her boyfriend, and now I'm doing a pair for her. It's very similar yarn. It's the same type of stripe, but it's different colors. And I'm using a specific type of heel that I'm going to be doing a technique video on soon, that I'm going to do a little overhead just to talk about how I constructed the sock and what it is about this heel that's really interesting. So we'll do that now, and then we'll come back. So this is the first sock that I was knitting for my daughter, and so I want to show you my approach for knitting this sock and getting it so that the heel, the striping sequence is maintained all the way down, and then the heel is framed by this stripe right here, how I did that. So I knew that I wanted the sock leg to be just about 7 inches long. And so as I was knitting with this yarn, I could see how long it was taking the stripes to play out. So I had a pretty good idea about where I would be when I got to the 7-inch point. So, and I knew it was going to be in somewhere in this blue stripe. So my plan was that when I was just finishing the blue speckled and I got to the light blue, when I got to where it was all light blue, I pulled out the yarn until I got to where it was starting with the brown speckled, and I folded the light blue in half. I found the center point of that light blue and I marked it with a pin so that I would knit this blue stripe until I got to that pin. That would mean I was halfway through the blue. And so when I was halfway through the blue, that was when I was going to stop and I was going to knit this heel. So this is what is called a plain heel. It's very much like a peasant heel. If you've ever done an afterthought heel where you just knit the entire leg and then you come back and you open up the heel in order to knit the heel and the round down to here and then graft it off. It's the same type of construction, except you don't wait. You knit this heel as soon as you are done with the leg. So like with any heel, when you get done with the leg, you are only going to be working across 50% of the stitches, right? So you normally let the instep stitches just sit on a spare needle, or you could put it on waist yarn. It just depends on what sort of situation you have going with your equipment. So you put the instep stitches on waist yarn. You're not working them right now. And so what that leaves you with is the heel stitches. So in order to work this heel in the round, so you have all of these stitches and all of these stitches, you're going to knit these in the round. You don't have anything over here right now. You've got these stitches on waist yarn and you've got your live stitches for the heel. So what you do is you do a provisional cast on. And then, so you knit across your heel and then you knit across the provisionally cast on stitches, and that establishes you in the round. So I was still working with this light blue yarn, and I worked this heel in the round, and I did my decreases all the way down. So the yarn continued to go through its progression in the striping pattern. So it continues down the back of the heel. Of course, the stripes change their width because you have fewer and fewer stitches as you're going here. And I ended with this blue speckle, which is lucky because after the blue speckle comes the light blue again. So I only had to pull off some of the blue speckle yarn in my ball until I got to that light blue again. And again, I found the exact center point of that blue yarn. And I had that provisional cast on here, and I had the instep stitches on waist yarn. So I put those back on the needle, and I picked up the stitches from the provisional cast on. And I joined my light blue yarn at the halfway point in between the blue stripe sequins, and I continued on. So then I got my full width of a blue stripe here, and I had a full width here and a full width here. So this was 1.5 blue stripes worth of yarn, but it gave me a full blue stripe at each point, and then I could just continue on with the yarn and the sequence continued. So the toe I'm using here is called a round toe. There are 8 decreases for every decreased round, and I did a video on how you decide how many plain rounds to do between decreased rounds. You can do what's called a long round toe or short round toe. There are different ways of doing it. And because I have pretty thick yarn and not a whole lot of stitches, I did where I did a setup round to reduce my 52 stitches down to 48 stitches, which is a multiple of 8. After that setup round, I did a plain round. And then I started my 8 decreases in the round. So I did, I think it was a knit 4, knit 2 together, knit 4, knit 2 together all the way around. And because I'd done a knit 4 together, I did 4 plain rounds. And then I did a knit 3 together, or knit 3, knit 2 together, knit 3, knit 2 together all the way around. Then I did 3 knit rounds. And then I did a knit 2 together, knit 2, knit 2 together with 2 plain rounds. And then I did a knit 1, knit 2 together, 1 plain round, and then I just did knit 2 together all the way around. And at that point you have 8 stitches remaining, and you could just do like you would fasten off for the crown of a hat by going around the live stitches and cinching them off. I don't want to do that. I didn't want to do that, so I only had 8 stitches. I had 4 stitches on each half, and I just grafted those stitches together to finish off the toe. You could do it by fastening them off. That's the traditional way of doing it. I just didn't feel like doing that. So that's how I knit the sock. What's nice about this type of heel is that you don't have to do a provisional cast on that matches the number of stitches that you put on waste yarn. So for this sock, I had 52 stitches around here, but my daughter and I have very high, long heel diagonal. We have high arches and high instep, and so a normal peasant heel doesn't fit us. So when I do that provisional cast on, I provisionally cast on 6 additional stitches. So instead of doing a provisional cast on of 26 stitches, I did 32. And then when I started the decreases, I did a single decrease every other round on each side of the heel until I was down to 26 stitches on this, until this matched this one. So on this half of the round, I was just working regular knits, and this half I was doing decreases every other round. And then once I got to about right here, I started doing central double decreases that created this perfect line. So these are double decreases, but that gave me more room. And then when I came back and I picked up the provisional cast on to go the other direction and the stitches that were on waste yarn here, again I had extra stitches here, and I would decrease those out every other round until they were all gone as well. So it creates this little area right here, this little triangular area here of a gusset, and that creates more room in this heel diagonal. So that worked really well for this. But that's not the only way you can use something like this. For her boyfriend sock, he has a 9-inch leg and a 10-inch foot. So there's a discrepancy between the circumference of his foot and the circumference of his leg. He needs more room in his foot. But his heel diagonal wasn't particularly large. He doesn't have really high arches. And so, but I knew I was going to need more stitches for his foot. So what I did for him was I just did a provisional cast on that did add some more stitches, the number of stitches he was going to need for his foot. And then I just worked, I worked the extra stitches, I worked decreases to decrease those extra ones out. I didn't work a plain round between. He didn't need that extra room in the heel, so I did every round. I did decreases until it was time to do the standard double decreases for working this in the round. So that's something you can do, is that if you have a mismatch, maybe some people have a larger ankle than a ball of foot. And so you could work the heel and then do your decrease gussets after that, or you could do something where you didn't provisionally cast on as many as you had for the leg. You could do fewer, and then instead of working decreases on this half of the round, you work them on the half of the round that has more stitches, which would be the back of the leg stitches, so it would have more. So you work your single decreases until again you've matched them up so that you have the same number on each half of the round, and then you can work your double decreases. So there are a number of ways to use this type of heel in order to accommodate fit issues, and it's something that I really like. So I will be doing some technique videos on this. I think it will probably take more than one technique video to explain all of the different combinations of how you could use this, not only for adding room or removing room, but also for how you can deal with different types of decreases, so that you can either get this line of double decreases like this, or you could work a standard set of decreases like you would work for a regular wedge toe, where they're more separated by net stitches. You could do either way. So as I mentioned in the overhead, I had a very specific plan for this sock that I didn't I didn't know ahead of time exactly how I was going to plan for the heel. I didn't know what stripe I would be in the middle of when I got to the heel. And so as I was knitting the leg, I kind of saw how things were playing out, and then I made my plan for the heel. And the plan was to very deliberately keep the collar sequence on the foot, but then also keep it all the way down the back of the leg, and figuring out how to make that happen. That's something that's really fun for me. It's not something that everybody would want to do. Some people don't care. And some people not only don't care about the striping sequence in one sock, they certainly don't care about making the second sock match the first one. For some people, they just cast on for the sock and then they knit all the way through, however the yarn plays out, and then they start the next sock wherever the first sock ended, they just start the second one. And that is a completely legitimate way of knitting your socks. It's your knitting. You get to decide what you want to do. It never once occurred to me to approach sock knitting that way. From the first pair of socks I knit with self-striping yarn, it was like, of course I would want to make them match, and how am I going to do that? and so the first few pairs of socks I knit was, process of how do I decide where I'm going to start the heel, and then how do I set up the second sock, something that's fun for me and interesting for me, and something that I want that result. So then I started the second sock, and I was in like this little brown speckled stripe right here. And what happened when I'm doing little stripes like these, a lot of times what I do is I start knitting the stripe, and you have to pull the yarn out of the center every so long. So a lot of times what I do is I just keep pulling the yarn out until I see the next stripe color show up, and then I relax, and then I just knit until I get through that stripe. So I was pulling the brown out, and I was looking for what the next color was going to be, which is going to be just the caramel color, the solid brown. And I'm pulling it out, and I see light blue coming out, and it's like, that doesn't make any sense, because you can see that right before the caramel color is the light blue. So I'd knit the light blue, I was in the middle of the caramel, I pulled all the caramel out till I got to the next stripe, and I did not see this color, I saw this color. And I was like, how is that even possible? Like, what? I just couldn't comprehend it. So I pulled the blue, I kept pulling the light blue out to see what was going to come after the light blue. And what I saw then was the blue speckled. So the colors were reversing. And I was like, what? And so then I stopped. I'm like, well, there must have been a knot in the yarn. And I'm just kind of visually quickly looking. I don't see a knot. So then I just held my fingers on the yarn and pulled it through until I could feel something. And then I could see there was this kind of felted join there in the yarn. So some companies, when there's a break in the yarn, or when they're winding a ball of yarn and you get to the end of one, big spool that they're winding the smaller balls off of, you get to the end of that one, then you tie it to the beginning of the next one. But sometimes there could be something like a tension problem in the machinery that would cause the yarn to snap. And so with self-striping yarn, I can usually tell, I think I can tell when there's just been a snap, because they're tying two of the same colors together, versus it's completely different. So that's a little irritating when it's completely different. It's irritating either way. If it's a solid color, 100% wool, and I'm knitting a sweater, I don't care. I cut the knot out, and then I just spit felt the ends together like I would if I got into the end of a ball of yarn and was starting another one. And I could continue on. It doesn't matter. If I buy a sweater's worth of yarn, I might have one of the balls with a knot. Maybe there might be two balls. Very, very occasionally there will be one ball of yarn that has two knots in it. That's a little more irritating. But again, if I can spit felt it together, it doesn't matter to me. When it's super wash wool, it's a bigger pain because you can't really spit felt those things together right away. You leave the tails hanging and you got to weave them in. And then when it's in a self-striping yarn where you're like me, where I'm planning to make things match exactly, even if they have tied together two pieces that are the same color, first of all, I don't know that it really came from the same, it was a break in the same, like that they were winding the ball, it broke, and they just tied the two ends back together. I don't know that for sure. And besides which, I want to get rid of that weird join, and so I'm going to have some tails that I need to weave in, so I'm going to lose some of the width of the stripe. So because I'm so persnickety that way, what I would normally do would be to just, like I was halfway through this brown speckled stripe, I would just go back to the end of the blue one, and then I would go back to the yarn where the break was, and I would just pull off the whole repeat until I got to the end of the light blue again and got to the beginning of a full brown speckle stripe, and I would join and I would continue on. That would be how I would normally work. But in this case, pulling off the yarn was just giving me yarn that was in reverse order. And what I couldn't understand was how things could have gotten reversed like that. Because my assumption is that when the color is applied to self-striping yarn, it's like it's printed on. It's not dyed into the yarn. It's like printed on the yarn. And so it's going to be done in a particular order, I assume. And I would assume that that progression happens the same consistently, and that anything that you were tying would be, you know, something that was going in the same direction. That was the thing that I couldn't understand. I have heard people say that when they buy the 50-gram balls of sock yarn, that occasionally they'll have one ball that's wound in the reverse direction. So I've heard of that before. I've never had that. I've hardly ever used 50-gram balls of self-striping yarn, very, very rarely. So I'm almost always 100-gram or 150-gram in this case, because it's a 6-ply, it's a thicker yarn. So that was a weird thing. And so it took me just, you know, a few minutes of thinking about like what happened, what's going on, and realizing that somehow it hadn't broken, and then they just tied the two ends that had broken apart together, that they had attached an end from something else that was going in the opposite direction. So I thought, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll just wind off the remaining balls. I'll find the tail at the end of the ball, and I'll wind it on using my ball winder, center pull ball, and then I'll be able to pull out of the center. I'll find the beginning of the stripe that I want, pull it off. And so as I was winding, I was watching the progression of the striping colors, and I was just checking it against the completed sock that I had, this other one. And I was like, wait a second, this is in reverse as well. How could that be? And then I thought, oh my God, there must be another break, another join somewhere where it reversed again. So not only was there one break in the yarn and a join, which is a pain in the rear in this kind of yarn, but there were two. So I had to find that one. And so I'm going through, and that was the same thing where they tied two blue speckled, two tails of blue speckled together. But so you know, the yarn had gotten to this brown speckle point, it reversed until it got some period of time down to the blue speckled. And then it continued on, but then there was another knot in there, and it was an actual knot. The other two were kind of joins, felted joins that they use with this air compression thing to join tails together like that. This was an actual knot. And in this case, the order of the colors was not reversed, but they just didn't even match. It was just like we're just tying two things together. I just could not believe it. I've never seen anything like that. So luckily, my daughter does not have terribly big feet, and so she's like me. Like, we don't need anywhere near the amount of yarn that comes in the full sock yarn. But I did have to kind of pull off these different sections. Then I had to look at, well, where does each one of these sections that are complete and go in a particular order, the correct order, where do they start, where do they end, how many repeats of the color do they have? Do I have any of these that can complete the entire sock sort of in order, or am I going to have to patch together with multiple balls? So I did have one major section that was most of what was left was all in one ball. And I think I can create the whole rest of the sock just with that particular piece of the ball. I won't need to go into these other smaller sections. But that was something that started out as kind of a minor annoyance, and it's just like kind of like what? So I've never seen anything. I'd be curious if any of you have seen anything like that. Now, I have to say, in 15 years of sock knitting, I've knit more than 100, probably close to 150 pairs of socks. I don't really know. So I've knit more than 100 socks, under 100 pairs, and under 200 pairs. And I can probably count on one hand the number of times that I've had any kind of break in like that in a self-striping ball of sock yarn. I've never had more than one break, and I've never had a reversal like that. So it's the kind of thing where I could complain to the yarn company, but I'm not sure to what end, like what I would want them to do about it, or if I just would want them to be made aware so that they could see which of it has the lot number, and they could maybe potentially see who is running that, and did they have quality control issues with that particular factory or whatever. But it's a discontinued yarn. It's not like it's being currently made and they could address something now in a factory that's currently producing yarn. It's I've had it for a couple of years and it was discontinued when I got it. But it was a very strange thing that I had never seen before. So I'm noticing that I have sort of different reactions and expectations when it comes to things like the yarn I'm using, or the projects that I'm knitting, and what sort of level of perfection I'm looking for, or what sort of expectation or hope that I have for a project or for the yarn I'm knitting with. And I have to say that I think what's going on in the world right now has affected my perceptions in some ways, and it's sort of made me maybe more demanding in some ways and more, whatever in other ways. So somebody had asked me in the live stream if I always correct every mistake that I make in my knitting. And I said, no, in fact, I have one I can show you right now that I've just decided I don't care. And it's in my Aran sweater. It's a very dark sweater, and there was a miscross cable on the back near, like right here. It's going to be, or maybe it'll end up being on this side, but it's going to be on the back. I won't see it when I'm wearing it. I doubt anyone else will ever even be able to see it because the yarn is so dark. And it's near the underarm. And it's the kind, and I didn't discover it until I had finished the back. So it was probably 9 or 10 inches down. And people said, oh, there's ways of fixing that by cutting it and doing this. And I'm like, oh, I know that. I totally know that it could be fixed. I know at least I have 3 different ways that I could fix it if I wanted to. And I kind of felt like I almost wanted to leave it there as a reminder of, if I do notice it again in the future, I'll just remember what was going on in the world when that mistake happened. And it just gives me a little bit of perspective about how I can let some things go. Like, some things just ultimately don't matter. It doesn't mean I don't want to do the best I can when I'm knitting a project. I just had a different feeling about that particular mistake when I saw it. I've been known to knit an entire sleeve cuff down and realized, oh, I was supposed to do this little stitch pattern along the, you know, the fake seam line that I forgot to do on this sleeve, and laddered down all 6 of those stitches for more than 100 rows in order to reknit it. Like, who's ever going to see it? Like, the fact that it wouldn't have, you know, matched this one, like, I'm not ever going to see it when I'm wearing it. Nobody else is going to notice it. It doesn't matter. And yet I did that. That was something I'm like, of course I'm going to fix that. And so it was just an interesting response that I had to that particular cable, and almost a desire to keep that error in there. Just as a way to kind of recenter myself a little bit. So I'm interested if any of you have noticed that you are more forgiving of yourself right now, or less forgiving, or if your expectations for perfection have just maybe shifted a little bit to the left or right or whatever. You know, how has your knitting life changed in your perspective on what you're knitting since the world changed this year? Let me know. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.